Honorable Chief Guest, Major General MD Imdadul Badi, Honorable Special Guest, Professor M. Abdul Qasim Mujumdar, Honorable Dean of Faculty of Strategic Studies, Brigadier General MD Siddiqul Alam, distinguished guests and journalists, my dear young friends. At the outset, I would like to thank the University Authority for inviting me here to speak about the changing scenario of media, culture, and society in Bangladesh. I am not very sure whether I am the right person to speak about this topic. I do not actually attend seminars and symposia, and I am never in the glare of publicity. So today I feel a bit nervous because I'm addressing a very learned audience about something of which I myself am not very aware and knowledgeable. I have been introduced to you as a learned speaker. I humbly say that I'm not as learned as I'm thought of. But as I'm dragged here by my student, Nuzaira Tarannum, she is now a lecturer in the Department of Media and Communication, and I was also approached by another student, former student of course. He is also a lecturer here, Ashraful Ghani. So I would also like to thank them that they have been successful in bringing me here. Well, I'm about to retire in June, and my entire life is confined to the classroom. Therefore, I do not feel comfortable when I attend very large audience gatherings and audiences. And I do not speak English. At the University of Dhaka, the medium of instruction is principally Bangla. Therefore, all my life, I have been speaking Bengali language. So it is another challenge for me. Nuzaira Tarannum has imposed this on me that you have to speak English. I am forced to speak English. So I will definitely fumble and stumble. So my linguistic inefficiency or incompetence is a barrier to successful communication. And I will always be groping in the dark for the right word of expression. So my apologies for my inefficiency and my incompetence. Let me now go to the topic. Before going into the details, I would like to define briefly the concepts of the topic. There are several concepts. You have already heard about the topic. Media and society, culture and change. Media, you are familiar with the word media, and generally television, newspaper and so on are called the media. But media has a wider meaning. Some of the students here may have heard of Marshall McLuhan. He was a Canadian-born media theorist. Some of his interesting and very important books are Understanding Media, The Gutenberg Galaxy, The Mechanical Bride. So he saw media as an extension of the human senses, extension of man. And from that perspective, my shirt, my shoes, my specs, my watch, everything that extends my senses are media. But I'm not going to discuss all this media here. I will confine our discourse mainly to television, newspaper, film, and of course books, which I consider a very important media. And you are also familiar with the word culture. Culture has many meanings. It has a very constricted meaning of cultural functions like literary, activity, literature, then film, music, and so on. But it has a wider meaning. Cultural refers to all the institutions, social, political, economic institutions in a society, and their activity, and the processes underlying those activity. That's the social meaning of culture. There are several meanings of culture, like documentary meaning, ideal meaning, and social meaning. The social meaning is, I think, the most important one, and we will view culture from that perspective. But the other meanings are not unimportant. These three meanings were given by Raymond Williams in his book entitled The Long Revolution. He is another media theorist or cultural theorist, and he actually proposed the cultural, he was the proponent of the cultural studies approach. There are many approaches to the study of media and society and culture. The cultural studies is also a very important approach. Raymond Williams, Stuart Hall, Richard Hoggart, they are the chief proponents of this approach. So, all these three meanings may be taken together, but the focus is on briefly, it is the entire social, cultural, political, economic activity taken together. And society is basically complex network of human relationships. Network of human relationships, that is society. So society and culture are very much interrelated, and media are or is an integral part of society and culture. And the fourth one is change. The change is the process of making or causing difference. Everything is in a state of constant change. It is in a flux. We are changing almost every moment, although we are not aware of that. Yesterday's Ahaduzzaman is not today's Ahaduzzaman. This may seem a bit paradoxical, but this is true. We may become stranger a few hours later. I'm actually referring to T.S. Eliot, a great poet of the last century. So when we meet again, we are actually strangers, because by this time we have changed psychologically. There may be changes in attitudes, there may be changes in moods, and also some physical changes is taking place. So everything, this is too philosophical. But this is true. So change is inevitable, change is indispensable, and from that perspective, the media are also changing, society is changing, cultural aspects are changing, everything is in a state of flux. So these are the concepts dealt with in this topic. And while speaking about the different aspects of changes, I will try to focus my attention on these explanations. Let me start with the newspaper first. let me go back to the past, my childhood in particular. Before going there, I would like to say that I will not be able to give you a very bright picture of what is happening. My depiction will be a bit bleak. You are all conscious students of media and communication. You are studying this subject with great optimism and also enthusiasm. I am not here to throw cold water on your enthusiasm, but it is, in my view, it is better to take a critical view of what is happening. So when I go back to my childhood, as far as I remember, I was introduced to two newspapers when I was about 10 or 11 years old. One was the Shangbad and the other was Morning News. I was introduced to these two newspapers by my father. And it is later when I thought about why I was introduced to these two newspapers. The Shangbad represented the progressive stance, while the Morning News represented the diametrically opposed stance. Morning News was supportive of conservative values, and it was supportive of pro-Pakistani ideology, Muslim League, and the Shangbad had a leaning towards the left perspective. I think my father was very liberal. He did not just push me to the Shangbad or to the Morning News. He wanted me to develop an open mind. That's why perhaps he exposed me to two newspapers which are opposed to each other. And another reason may be there of choosing Morning News, because Morning News was its English was good. Its perspective may be conservative, and in certain cases it was reactionary as well, but good English. So that may be another reason. If you look at the history of this country, of Deed in Pakistan, then you will see these contrary views, contrary perspectives developing in the political sphere as well. You should keep this in mind, that the media, the press, and politics are very much interrelated. And as a matter of fact, political development contributed to the growth of the newspaper and vice versa. And the 1950s and the 1960s were full of political agitation, political movement, political resistance. It started with the language issue. You may remember in the late 1940s when attempts were being made to undermine the importance of Bangla language, which culminated in the 1952 language movement. And at that time, the newspapers played a very significant part in promoting the cause of Bangla language. And some newspapers like the Shangbad, the Ittifaq, and Ittihad. Ittihad is, extinct. These newspapers played a very significant part on the language question. And another newspaper which was published from Sylhet, Nau Bilal, that also played a very significant part. Azad was also a dominant newspaper at that time. Azad its editor was also a learned person, Maulana Akram Khan. But this newspaper actually played different roles at different times. Basically, it was also pro-conservative, but on language issue, when there was tremendous pressure from the people, when there was, political resistance, this newspaper also changed its position. It also was supportive of the language movement. So it is very interesting that politics and the growth of the newspapers were actually interactive, interrelated. Other political events like the Jukta Front or the United Front elections, you see, after independence in 1947, it was realized that the very creation of Pakistan was not serving the interests of the people of this part of the country, the East Pakistan. The differences were clear, evident. The discrepancies were also clear. It started with the language issue, then it spread into political freedom, and so on. And after 7 years after, you see, there was no constitution. The first constitution came into being after the 1954 election. So a tendency to impose a kind of autocracy was also evident. So all this was being challenged by the newspaper, the press. The press played the most important part. It gave support to the political movements, the political resistance, and the autonomy questions also came to the fore after the 1954 election. The 1954 election was a grand success, or the grand success of the opposition parties. The Muslim Leagues had a very terrible defeat, a shocking defeat in that election. But unfortunately, the United Front government did not last long. There were, inter-front conflicts. So it broke up very soon. And gradually, towards the end of the 1950s, martial law was imposed under the dictatorship of Ayub Khan, which continued for a decade. So all these political cross-currents were being focused in the newspapers. The newspapers played a significant part in the 50s and also in the 1960s. These 2 decades were full of political activity, political tension, political resistance, political movement. The 1962, for example, the 1962 movement against the Hamidul Rahman Education Commission report, then the 1966 6-point movement, then 1968 11-point movement, and which finally culminated in the War of Independence. So the 1950s and the 1960s were of central importance in the shaping of the character of the newspapers. And the newspapers also impacted on the political development of the country. So these 2 decades were, in my view, the most important phase in the journalism history of this country. And I do not think that today's journalism has reached that level. It may be, my view may not be accepted by you all, but I feel that today's journalism is showing a decline in quality of content, in quality of presentation. Even after independence in 1971, there were newspapers coming up, and in the 1980s as well, we saw the newspaper played a very important part. There was a temporary setback sometime in the 1970s, and perhaps that was necessary in the light of the the then circumstances. You know the history. The mid-1970s. In the mid-1970s, there was a temporary ban on the newspapers, and the Indian government thought it was necessary to do this because after independence, there was a lot of chaos and confusion in the political sphere, and this happened in other countries as well. If you look at the history of Russia, then you will see that similar things happened there. So the anti-liberation forces were also active after independence, and also the left forces who did not agree with the Indian government were also putting up resistance politically. And the newspapers, quite a number of the newspapers also fabricating news. There was distortion of facts. So as a consequence of which, the Indian government put a temporary ban on newspapers. Some say that it was a right decision, others do not agree. So I'm not going into that controversy. But after that, the ban was raised and the newspapers played its part. And if you look at the history of the 1980s, you will see that newspapers are again putting up resistance. For a long time, there was a kind of autocracy in the country, and there was political movement in the 90s. And it is very interesting to note that at that time, the two major political parties of the country were united. That was a very good period, I think, that there was cooperation and coordination, mutual understanding and mutual respect at that time, unfortunately, which is absent today. And that time, the newspapers put up resistance. So politics and the press went together, hand in hand, helping each other, interacting each other. Then there was a political changeover in the early 1990s. The autocratic regime was over and a kind of democratic environment ensued, and there was an election under the caretaker government, and that caretaker government did something very good, particularly in relaxing the Special Powers Act. Some of the acts were abrogated, and we are still enjoying the benefits or fruits of that change. The newspaper is now enjoying a considerable degree of freedom because of what the caretaker government did at that time. It is, many say that it would not have been possible if the caretaker government did not do that at that time. So after the relaxation of this special acts and after the inception of democracy in the early 1990s, new newspapers are coming up, and gradually you will find that there is an abundance of newspapers. There was almost a mushroom growth of newspapers. I am not very sure whether this growth created a very congenial atmosphere, because this quantitative rise did not coincide the qualitative increase. So there was a growth,